everyone. My name is Emily Cleese. I'm a geospatial specialist for the Pennsylvania Game Commission, and I'm out of the North Central region. We have 6 regions within the Pennsylvania Game Commission and a geospatial specialist in each of those. So outside of the 6 geospatial specialists, we have 3 geospatial analysts and then our chief of the GIS division. When we're working on projects, mainly we work within our regions, but we are also pooled into statewide projects or multi-state projects, which is actually the case for this study. For this study, we were looking at a suitability analysis for American Marten, and we utilized LANDFIRE data and a couple other data sets for this project. There were a couple LANDFIRE layers that we ultimately did not end up using, but I want to go through the ones that we did and ones that we didn't and the reasons why throughout this presentation. The first thing that I wanted to do was give you a background on the study itself. So the main question that we needed to ask was, does Pennsylvania have suitable habitat for American Marten currently? Tom Keller, a fur-bearer biologist at the Pennsylvania Game Commission, was tasked with the creation of an American Marten reintroduction and management plan. And one big aspect of that was, does Pennsylvania currently have suitable habitat if we were to relocate and reintroduce American Martens here? And so if you look on the right, you can see the map that I had created off of historic Marten range and current Marten range. You can also see some of the translocation sites that American Martens have been reintroduced across the US and Canada as well. So currently we do not have Martens in Pennsylvania. They were extirpated, meaning they were no longer found in Pennsylvania around 1920s. Mainly due to over-timbering, over-harvesting of our woods, and then also potentially over-harvesting of the mammal itself through hunting. One of the main things that we wanted to see was whether we have current habitat for this species prior to reintroducing the species to our landscape. To do that, we needed to look at the habitat that we had in Pennsylvania and whether that habitat matches what the American Marten needs. American Martens are mainly associated with mature forests and have strong ties to conifers. I've been told that's because they raise their pups within conifers, although that's not to say that they can't be found within mixed or deciduous forest as well. Michigan was one of the cases where they do have a strong deciduous component and are doing well in that population. We'll take a look at that a little bit further on in the presentation as well. Another thing that's really important for martens are structural complexity from the floor to the canopy of the forest, mainly looking at the woody debris, rock piles, snow, things that they can hide from predators that may be looking to predate them. Canopy cover also plays a role in that. Again, protection from predators. Not many people originally know how big these creatures are, but they are about the size of a squirrel, being 2 pounds and about 24 inches on average. So predation is something that happens with these mammals frequently, and so having a complexity to the forest is very important to them. They also do not thrive in human development, and so getting rid of areas in this analysis that have high human development is important as well. They're looking for this continuous forest habitat for them to be able to move and continue their population. The study area that we're looking at for this study, of course, Pennsylvania is included. That's where we're looking to do the reintroduction, but we also wanted to include states that currently have martens or states that we know martens have been relocated to. In that case, we were looking at Michigan, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. These states either already have current marten populations or have reintroduction efforts that have taken place over the past couple years. You'll also see at the end that we have used some of these known locations for truthing our model as well. One of the things that we wanted to do by including these other states in the analysis was gain information on where known martens are located with our different layers that we have, and see if those known locations overlap with what our model uses as a optimal habitat or optimal suitability for the species. Since our study area spans multiple states, we could not utilize just our state game lands layers in this analysis. One of the reasons being we're not just using state game lands as a suitability analysis for this, and that's again because we wanted to be able to truth the model and see where known populations currently are. Even in Pennsylvania, if we were to use only our public lands, we would be missing those private lands where potentially there could be high suitability areas in there as well. And then looking at other states, we would need to have a similar data set where we really don't. And so what we needed to do was find layers that spanned statewide. LANDFIRE was one of the places that we looked originally for a lot of these layers. And so the main ones being taking into consideration the habitat that was needed, percent canopy cover, stand age as a metric for tree height, land cover, and snow cover. So percent canopy cover was important to the species for that predation that might be occurring, and LANDFIRE had a great data source for that. So we used the LANDFIRE 2020 existing vegetation cover layer for that. Stand age, we really didn't have a layer, at least through my research and others' research on this for the states that we were looking at. Stand age really wasn't a layer that we could utilize for this analysis. So instead of stand age, we ended up utilizing tree height as a metric of age. While we know this might not be perfect because depending on the species, they could be different heights, we did ultimately use tree height to get at an older forest, knowing that they should typically be a taller tree height. We did work with our foresters who were able to bin these or get these groupings for us for our optimal habitat. And again, LANDFIRE was utilized for this in the existing vegetation height layer. Land cover was another thing that was going to be crucial for this suitability analysis. Ultimately, it came down to two layers that we were looking at, NLCD land cover or LANDFIRE's existing vegetation type. Ultimately, we ended up using NLCD land cover for this analysis because of the more broad groupings that it had. While LANDFIRE was great and gave us these very specific categories, NLCD already had these binnings that we were interested in for the suitability index, and so ultimately we ended up using NLCD. That isn't to say that we didn't use LANDFIRE in the remaining portions of this suitability analysis. Whenever we got into just looking at Pennsylvania, we did utilize LANDFIRE, and we have utilized LANDFIRE in other projects that we've been working on at the Game Commission as well. We just decided to go with NLCD for this specific portion of a multi-state effort for this first suitability analysis for American Marten. Snow cover was also important, and that data set was gathered from the National Weather Service, where we ended up averaging snow depth from 2009 to 2019. For this analysis, ArcGIS Pro and Python notebooks were utilized. One of the main reasons that we like to use Python notebooks at the Game Commission is for, one, record keeping, making it reproducible science, and then we can also export this. Now, that's not only to say we can export it to send it along to someone, but we can also utilize this whenever we're giving presentations. I've done a couple of presentations on this either internally at the Game Commission or externally, and was able to utilize my Python notebook to go through each of the steps. Now, if you're new to Python or don't know how to read Python very well, the snippet that I gave you to the right might not be super useful, but I did want to give an example of the Python notebook that was utilized for this analysis. Again, we utilize notebooks a lot at the Game Commission, and we really like to use them because of record keeping and that reproducible science aspect. It was very useful in this case as well, because as we were going through this suitability analysis, since it's stretched a couple of years, I was able to input newer data that LANDFIRE had come out with very minimal effort, because I already had all of the steps written down and could just rerun my code with that new data set. So once we had all of the layers that we wanted to use, the next step of our project was going to be assigning these habitat suitability indexes to each of the layers. The first one we'll start with is LANDFIRE's percent canopy cover. So for this, we used literature review. Tom Keller, again, the fur bearer biologist for the Pennsylvania Game Commission, did a lot of literature review and was able to come up with these binnings. We also worked with our foresters and other biologists, land managers at the Game Commission to help us come up with these habitat suitability indices for each of the layers. So you can see on the screen there the attributes that we had used and then the assigned HSI value. Those HSI values ranged from 100 to 0. In this case, we assigned it no data so that it was excluded from the cell statistic that we would do in this suitability analysis. I did also want to give you a screenshot of the attributes just because I really liked how LANDFIRE broke down their percent canopy cover, and same with their height data. So you can see here they broke it down based off of tree versus shrub cover. Other data sets might only give you canopy cover in general, and so shrub and tree might be included together. And what we were really looking for was just tree percent canopy cover, and so we were able to pull out those values. The other thing that we really liked with this data set was the binnings or the groupings of percent canopy cover was not already assigned. And so they had a different attribute for each individual percent, and so we could set those binnings ourselves, which was very important for this analysis. Very similar for stand age. In this case, we used tree height, LANDFIRE's existing vegetation height layer. And again, we worked with our foresters, land managers, biologists to come up with an attribute binning that made sense to pull out these older growth forests. And looking at the attributes in tree height from LANDFIRE's data, you can see again they include the different land cover types and show you that tree height, and then it's broken down in 1 meter increments, so you can set your own groupings again. That was really important for us to be able to set those groupings off of what would be suitable for the specific species we were working on. Again, land cover was used for this analysis because of these very broad groups that you can see over on the right, where we had coniferous being an HSI value of 100, mixed meaning mixed coniferous and deciduous 75, and deciduous 50. We didn't want to give shrub a no data because potentially shrubby areas could be important to this species, but not nearly as important as these large forested areas. So it got an HSI value of 25. Finally, snow cover. That data came from Tom's research and literature review on what this species is typically found in for snow depth. So let's get into the geoprocessing tools that we used for each of these layers. Keep in mind that over on the right, I'm only showing a snippet of one of the layers at a time. But the first thing that we ended up doing was extracting by mask. That clipped the areas to my study states. Now, LANDFIRE, you can download the data based off of state boundaries, but I ended up grabbing a rectangle over the entire study state area because I needed to have a buffer set on the states because of a tool that I'm going to be using later on in step 4, focal statistics. So I set a buffer that I wanted around the states, downloaded the data in a rectangle format, and then used extract by mass to clip all that data. I did this for each of the 4 layers that were used. We actually did this with 5 layers, coarse woody debris, or a metric for coarse woody debris, which I'll talk about later on. Ultimately, we didn't end up using that layer in this final suitability, but we did this entire process on 5 layers altogether. During this extract by mask, we were also able to set environments so that aligned all of the cells as well. The next step was to reclassify each of the layers involved based off of those habitat suitability index values that we had gone over in the past couple slides. So this is an example of the tree height habitat suitability index, where the lowest suitability would be given a number of 25 and the highest would be 100. And in this case, those higher, taller trees would be given an optimal suitability of 100. This was the case for each of the other layers, where we had the highest snow level, coniferous trees being the highest HSI value, and then percent canopy cover greater than 50% was given an HSI value of 100. Once each of those layers were assigned a habitat suitability index and reclassified, then we went ahead and ran cell statistics. In this case, we used sum so that we could sum up all of the habitat suitability indexes. And now what we were left with was rasters and cells with the highest optimal suitability being 400, meaning it scored 100 in each of the layers that were added together, or down to 25, where it only scored at most 25 in one of the categories. So we would leave those areas out in our final calculations. Now, if I go back one slide, you can see in the cell statistics, it was more broad, but looking at focal statistics, what we wanted to do was really pinpoint those areas that would have high suitability. So to utilize this and determine areas with continuous high suitability, we used focal statistic, which was a moving window that you can use on your raster data sets. So focal statistics, in this case, you can decide what type of statistic you want to run on your raster. And in this case, we wanted to run an average of the HSI values within a specific area. The area that we defined was an American Marten's home range, or average home range. In this case, it was about 3 miles. And so we had a moving window of 3 miles for every raster from that last step of the analysis. What you're left with is pixels assigned a value of the average within that American Marten's home range, and you can see that really ties down what is optimal suitability for the species. Ultimately, we did find the species had suitable habitat in Pennsylvania. If we look at the results, we did find that we do have suitable habitat in Pennsylvania, and suitability ranges were determined off of known Marten locations from iNaturalist research grade points, and also sites where Martens were reintroduced where we had their home ranges off of radio collars. We did truth off of these radio collars, and I'm going to zoom into some of these areas on the next slide. It was awesome to overlay these points on the analysis after we were done with it and see on the left, this was Michigan's relocation project, where they had relocated multiple Martens in one of their state forests. And those white kind of bands that you see on the left are known Marten home ranges off of the radio collars. And it was awesome to see them circling that dark green optimal habitat. Same with on the right, having the iNaturalist research grade sightings and images that came with those, all being within our optimal range or very close to it. It was a great way to truth our model and see that we were able to pull out this optimal habitat. So 2 of the layers that we did not utilize in the suitability analysis itself were LANDFIRE existing vegetation type, and then LANDFIRE 40 Scott and Bergen fire behavioral fuel models. So we wanted to use land cover from LANDFIRE, but again, because of all of the specific vegetation types, which are extremely helpful in other projects that we do, especially outside of state game lands, this one, it just got way too specific by state. And so using a more broad category from NLCD was important for us in this case. That's not to say we didn't utilize this data in the end for our reintroduction when we were choosing the specific sites that we wanted to reintroduce these martens. But when we were looking at state by state suitability analysis, pulling out specific trees from Maine versus Pennsylvania, we have very little overlap. And you can see that from the screen grab I took from LANDFIRE's data and their data download page, where you can see not many of the colors are overlapping between Pennsylvania and Maine. Now, could we have taken the time to pull out the different species that we wanted from Maine and Pennsylvania and, Michigan, New York? Of course. But in our case, it was faster and easier to use a more broad data set to begin with, where we're just giving coniferous instead of northeastern oak forest or something more specific. That's not to say we haven't used this data set in other suitability analyses or other projects at the Game Commission. It was just for this one, it was better for us to use NLCD because they had those broad categories already assigned for us. And then I had also mentioned the Scott and Bergen fire behavioral fuel models. One of the reasons that we wanted to utilize this layer was because we do a prescribed fire program at the Pennsylvania Game Commission, and this was brought up in that program as well, looking at fuel models. One of the problems that we found, though, with the data set was it was very pixelated in Pennsylvania, where you would have one 30 by 30 meter cell next to another 30 by 30 meter cell. One would have fuel models and the next one would not. And just knowing the landscape in Pennsylvania, that doesn't seem to be accurate to what's on the ground here. And even the other states that I pulled out, it seemed to be very pixelated, not many continuous areas. And so ultimately, we didn't feel like we could utilize this in our analysis. I pulled out a couple of the fuel models that we are interested in. I'll have to bring up that online if anyone has any questions on what they were, but we mainly were pulling out any of the fuel models that had down debris. We were trying to use that for coarse woody debris. And ultimately, like I said, most of the fuel model for Pennsylvania was leaf litter, which that wasn't super helpful for our analysis. Leaf litter, while it does provide some cover, we were looking more for coarse woody debris in this case. And I'm not sure why some of that wasn't pulled out. I do think probably because Pennsylvania has a more deciduous component, we do have a lot of leaf litter, so I think that would make sense. But unfortunately, it just didn't pull out the coarse woody debris like we had hoped it would. And so ultimately, we decided not to utilize this in the model. We thought it would skew it in a way that wasn't representative of what was on the ground. That being said, we did not find another data source to put in for coarse woody debris either, so we left it out altogether and relied on field verification for coarse woody debris for those relocation sites that we were proposing in the end. If you have any other questions or are interested in reintroducing the American Marten and all of the information that went into it, we do have a story map. I will say Tom Keller, our fur bearer biologist, spent a ton of time putting work into this. I have a couple maps that you can actually use online and look. If you're in Pennsylvania, you can scroll in and see how your backyard is suitable for American Marten or not. It was a really cool project to be part of. Unfortunately, our commissioners had voted to table this project. And so after a little over 2 years, it's not never going to happen, but it won't be brought back up to be voted for an actual official reintroduction unless the commissioners decide to do so. and it's currently not actively being talked about anymore. So a lot of work went into this, a lot of really cool research went into this, and unfortunately, as of now, we will not be going forward with the reintroduction, but that's not to say we didn't learn a lot and have a lot of fun throughout the process. So with that, I'll turn it on over for any questions that you might have for me or LANDFIRE.
Just, I knew that you incorporate forest inventory analysis data into that, and I'm familiar with that program. I think that's a great choice and a great source. I'm just trying to picture how that gets applied, because they're thorough points, but they're relatively few on a per acre, if you wanted to look at it that way. So how does data like whatever you want to choose, canopy base height or whatever, get applied from data, good data we have from a FIA source to comparable, or just get applied to the other parts of the data set? I'm of course particularly interested in the fuels and fire. I use LANDFIRE product primarily for fire modeling purposes. So anyways, just a general curiosity question about that.
Yeah, FIA. We use cover and height from the FIA plots to train the models. But then canopy base height and canopy bulk density are derived from equations. Base height is, some FES equations that we have developed, some linear regression model, and then the canopy bulk density is some linear regression models. So it's not directly like predicted from the training data, but it's more indirect.
Okay, but does it get compared or used as a verification at some point?
As of right now, no, it doesn't.
Well, in terms of the model leaving plots out, when we develop the prototypes, we'll leave plots out to understand how well the model is working. But yeah, I think overall, we're using that machine learning. So we're extracting training data from all of the spectral reflectance, as well as some other raster data that can contribute to that mapping. So yeah, that's really how we're doing it. It's just sort of your pretty simple machine learning algorithms at this point. We're looking into more sophisticated ones that are coming out. So that's how we extrapolate across the landscape, those training data. And it's not just FIA, right? So we use FIA, but we have probably 4 or 5 national data sets that we pull in, as well as any submitted data sets from states like Pennsylvania, for example. Any vegetation plot data that we can calculate. We need species, we need cover, we need height, so we pull in anyone that wants to give us vegetation plot data, we will take it.
Yeah. Well, the nexus, I guess, of that is, my work is, I'm a fire planner for the state of Colorado. I work in the state fire division. But my work history is I was a forester for a lot of years with Colorado State Forest Service. Did a lot of fuels work and prescribed burning and fuels treatments and timber stales and a lot of those kind of things. And I have participated on forest inventory analysis plots. So it's just, and now I'm doing all this fire modeling for fire spread prediction and all these things. So, and of course, LANDFIRE is really a great, that's always the great starting point. And I appreciate that you still publish previous year's ones, because, in fire modeling, you're basically, at least initially, trying to replicate what the fire has done so far. And sometimes switching the fuel model is a way to do it. And rather than doing an exercise of changing those, it's nice to just say like, oh, the 2014 thought that this was more of a timber data set than a grass shrub data set. So in our modeling, we can choose various versions of it, and I really like that. just because there's some different interpretations. There's probably also represented some change over time, so I recognize that's a potential flaw with going to an older data set. But again, in that specific context, I'm just trying to replicate what this fire has done in this real specific circumstance right now. So anyways, but you know, those fuel loadings are super important. I'm real interested in the canopy base height because that's one of the really key things for wildfires to transition from a surface fire to a crown fire. And that's, of course, when they make their really abrupt movement is when it transitions to crown fire. So at least in forested systems. So anyways, just kind of the forester part and the fire guy part, just trying to make those connections and link it together.
So it looks like Michelle has a question about like how small or large of plots we're interested in. And that, you know, that's actually a really good question. I don't think we have a stated minimum or maximum. So I don't know, Darren, do you have insight on that? I feel like, you know, we don't get super small ones and we don't get super big ones typically submitted, but.
No, yeah, we don't have like a cutoffs, but anything that is representative of a 30-meter pixel. So the plots can be smaller as long as it's, you know, collected in an area that's, you know,
undisturbed.
Larger landscape. Yeah.
We want disturbed as well. Like we need to map everything. So.
But it's basically been disturbed by nature itself. I mean, it's pretty much been blocked off an area of our plot as the previous owner had wished it to be done. So it's under 4 acres though. And the first half is much disturbed. As it leads farther to the west, it becomes more undisturbed. But as I mentioned, it's old oak savanna from the research that I've gathered, and I'm coming from an allied health field to plant biology. So anyway, I'm still learning. So I'm here really to get a lot of information, but how small?
Yeah, I mean, we typically do kind of, we use that plot data to kind of relate it to a bunch of satellite spectral imagery or topography, climate, you know, so but it usually is that 30-meter pixel, right? That we're hoping that the plot is representative of.
And 30-meter pixel in layman terms would be from like above. 30, are you suggesting you're looking at
30 by 30
okay.
Yeah, square kind of. Yeah.
Okay. Lot to learn.
Yeah. I did want to clarify, Megan, the vegetation groupings that are available. So Emily was mentioning that the vegetation classifications that she was looking at for the existing vegetation type layer that we have were too broad. And so I just wanted to make sure that our users are aware that within the EVT legend, there are groupings within the legend. And so you don't have to use the 800 vegetation classes. You can use the groupings, right? So there's like EVT subclass and, you know, and then with the MVC layers, there's the different hierarchies of the National Vegetation Classification hierarchy there. So there's, you know, group, macro group, you know, it kind of has that grouping within the legend. And so if you did want to use the LANDFIRE vegetation type, you could generalize it. based on what's already in that legend.
Thanks, Inga. Emily, hi, I have a question for you. And first, a couple comments. It's so cool to see this. I think when I first met you, you were just getting started with building the model, and it's cool to see how it's evolved. And a couple of comments. First, I love that you scripted this so it can be reran. Think that's just an increasingly important approach. So thank you for that. It's really cool. And I don't read Python, but it was still cool to see your code. I really appreciated the interdisciplinary nature of this work. So we had, you on the analysis side, you had wildlife people and foresters. And I wondered if you could speak to your experience in working with the foresters and wildlife folks and their familiarity with LANDFIRE data, their familiarity with raster data, and what that was like for you, the GIS analyst. Was it a lot of translating? Had they worked with LANDFIRE data before? Did they see use for their work? That sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for all your comments. I actually was shown the data set from Scott Baer, one of our habitat leads. So he had pointed this data set out to me. I had seen it before, but he really showed how this could be a really crucial part of this analysis, just because LANDFIRE spread so many states and had a data set that we could utilize in the entire analysis. I will say most of the other individuals that I worked with on this had not used LANDFIRE, but I've pointed a lot of different folks at the Game Commission to this data set. All of our GIS people now on different projects have utilized it in different times. Our elk biologist has looked at the specific herbaceous components for some of the studies that they're doing. It is especially useful to us in areas where we might be working outside of our game lands boundaries. Like I had mentioned, we do create stands on our state game lands, so we do have a really good stand age, stand type, height, basal area, site size, everything like that for our forested components, and then how we're managing that land. But when we're working with the public or even DCNR, where we might have differences in the way that we collect data, having a data source that is the same throughout, no matter if it's public or private, has been really crucial for some of these studies. So I'm spreading the word. We're definitely using LANDFIRE for more projects at the Game Commission, and I'm sure we're going to continue to use it as we have more suitability analysis. So it was new for a lot of people, but it's not going to be the only time that we use this for sure.
Great, thanks, Emily. And Michelle, going back to your point about birds, Amber just noted a bird use of LANDFIRE data, and there are a few others in Google Scholar. If you search Google Scholar bird habitat and LANDFIRE, you'll come up with multiple looks at this question. But Emily, yeah, great. Thanks for your comments on that. And we stand ready to help if you need us.
Really quick, that just reminded me, whenever we were working on the analysis, we were able to get on a call with Randy whenever I was looking at trying to utilize the fuel layer. So that was extremely helpful. Ultimately, we didn't end up using that for the analysis, but looking through the way that that layer was created was extremely helpful and eye-opening for me to know whether to use that or not in the data set. So no matter what, they seem to be very helpful to each part of the process that we were doing for the analysis. So thanks to you all for doing that for us.
Yeah, and I thought it was a super clever idea, and I was just curious if anyone else has heard of using fuels data for other uses other than mapping, fire spread or, in the fire world. I thought it was a clever idea, even though it didn't work. I'm curious if others have heard of people using fuels data for wildlife or.
That's I think maybe the first time I've heard of, using the fuels data for habitat, but I think, if you had sort of a more general question that it might work, but with the specifics of the coarse woody debris, it was a little too general for that. Yeah.
Bob asked, Emily, was it difficult to align the NLCD and LANDFIRE data?
No, it was not. Both of those were 30-meter raster data sets, and they did use the same projection. And so those were actually already aligned. I did set my environments whenever I did the extract by mask The issue that I had was with the snow data because it was I think 1,000 by 1,000 meter pixel, just because a lot of weather data that you get is not down to 30 by 30 meter pixels. And so that one was honestly the trickiest one to align, but NLCD and LANDFIRE worked really well together.
Yeah, and we do use or we have in the past used all of the developed classes from NLCD and the roads, and so yeah, they should line up pretty well, just in the general built environment as well.
Are PA stand data sets useful as potential plots?
So I'm not sure who that would be for, but I'm curious, maybe Inga or Darren, if states often submit their stand data from forest inventories that they do, and if that is useful. Emily, would that be a huge lift for the foresters? Would that be plausible? Is it proprietary? Yeah, curious about that.
Yeah, so the way that we typically handle that, we have sent out our land cover data in the past. A lot of the times it's for research projects that are going on. I would just have to get approval, in my case, from the project owner or the data set owner. Some of the things we wouldn't include probably are like management type, but for you all, the cover type is what you would be most interested in, I would guess, which would be the actual type of vegetation on the ground. And that I know we have sent out in the past. It's something that I would need to double check with the data owner. But as long as you don't mind some of it potentially being out of date, we update our land cover layer every 5 years. So we try to update it in a rolling basis as projects go on. But we are required to do an update every 5 years on each of our game lands. So some of the data could be a little bit out of date. But other than that, I could check to see if we could share that, if that would be useful.
Yeah, Inga or Darren, would that be useful, or is that too big of a leap from their potential cover type assignments to something that LANDFIRE could use?
Yeah, it's potentially something we could use. I mean, if not for even just for life form, trying to determine if it's tree, shrub, or herbaceous dominated. And beyond that, I mean, if there's percent cover height of the dominant vegetation, and if the cover type is specific enough, we can crosswalk it to one of our ecological systems or NVC group types.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's just good to have the local efforts as a check, It's just like, does this make sense?
Is there a way to crosswalk data contributed to changes made in LANDFIRE?
Washington, D.C., but I work with a lot of like local governments and folks that are interested in supplementing LANDFIRE with, let's say project-based data that they've done. So let's say treatments or something like that. I've never been through I've never contributed that data to LANDFIRE, but I was curious, since you guys mentioned, things that could be changed in LANDFIRE on an annual basis. When somebody submits that data, is there a way to reference how, let's say, fuel data, a difference in fuel data on an annual basis based on, can you reference where that came from? If it's the machine learning algorithm or if it's, someone's contribution.
For treatment data, like that's more polygon based. I think so we have, our plot data that we ask for that we use to kind of model our vegetation. And then we have our polygon treatment type data, like someone did a prescribed fire or they, did a thinning. So that's sort of a separate kind of ask that we have. Like we do want that polygon treatment data. And that feeds directly into the fuels changes. Now, the things that we need for that polygon data are disturbance type. We need to know the date. And what else? I guess that's pretty much it. So if we detect change via the imagery, then we will assign severity within that polygon. And it's not going to be all one severity. It'll be a mix depending on how the imagery calculates severity. We use DMBR for that, so a normalized burn ratio. Yeah. So that is important to us because it does help us assign a cause, right? Like a disturbance type. And that directly feeds into our fuel rule changes. So things that change the surface fuels and the canopy fuels.
I guess so. Then a follow-up: if somebody submitted a polygon, is there a way to know the following year that the changes that occurred in Landfire were reflective of that contribution, or was that through a different process? I'm just trying to figure out how to reference something.
Yeah, I mean, you should see it in the map. But you mean the exact, like, okay, we submitted all of these. I mean, you would have to essentially take our fuel layers and overlay what you submitted in terms of polygons and just extract that data from the year before. And then once we've made the changes to see what those changes were.
Okay, but there's no, other than an exercise where I'm doing a comparative analysis, there's no way to, from a like sourcing and referencing standpoint, see that the changes were a result of Landfire's process for categorization or from a contribution. There's no way to georeference contributions that are then reflected in Landfire.
Yeah, I think it was a great question. So, and I think a sort of a compromise idea would be, so you can download the disturbance data, and in the disturbance data are attributes that talk about confidence of assignment to a particular type of disturbance, where the disturbance came from. There's some fields around that. Also, we have reference databases. So I think that I haven't done this, but it seems to me, and Darren and Inga again can speak to this more, or Jim, I think you can kind of link things through. There's a little bit of effort with a couple other products you would have to use. But I think that you could see that. We also have transition rule sets that those are, I don't think that is one of the way that we tie it all together, but I don't think those are necessarily reviewable by users just because due to the sheer size of them, they're not kind of manicured for the public. Yeah, I think that you could kind of trace it back in a crude way with some of Landfire's products.
Okay, thank you. No,
it's a little vague, but I'd be interested to maybe explore a landscape with you via Zoom. And yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. So we could definitely talk another time.
It's definitely possible. Yeah, just so maybe indirect. Yeah, I think Randy definitely help you.
Sure, and the question really comes from, let's say, a municipality, wants to see this reflected in Landfire. They always want to get credit for good work done, etc. But if there's no way for them to potentially understand that change was a result of their own contribution, it's hard to get that feedback loop for them.
Yeah, I think there definitely is a way. It's if you have further questions, we can do a little walkthrough. Maybe Randy and I can get together with you, give you our suggestions for how to do that.
And
sure.
And then Oliver, just to add to that, Corey Blankenship on our team has been thinking about this a lot as well, because the Nature Conservancy has that exact same question. How do we track progress? How do we, claim progress if we did something? Very relevant questions right now. So it would be fun to connect and learn more about your landscapes or places you're working and specific questions, and see if we can, further the conversation.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you.